You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to On the Way Home. I'm your host, Emmy Kelly. Today, we are honored to be joined by Marie-Josée Houle, Canada's first federal housing advocate. Reappointed earlier this year, Marie-Josée has been a powerful voice in advancing the right to housing, bringing national attention to issues like encampments, financialization of housing, and the unique challenges faced by Indigenous communities. With experience spanning frontline work, housing co-ops, research, and now federal advocacy, Marie-Josée brings both deep expertise and a clear commitment to centering the voices of people most impacted by the housing crisis. We're excited to explore her perspective on where Canada is making progress, where we're falling short, and what it will take to ensure housing is truly treated as a human right. Let's listen in. Marie-Josée, thank you so much for joining us today. Here on the way home, we start off each episode asking our guests, what does home mean to you?
Well, on a personal note, I am here as a person who's experienced poverty, displacement, geographic marginalization, and housing precarity. So for me, home means being able to live in a home that allows people to live in dignity. And this follows the idea of the right to housing. And the right to housing is more than just a slogan. Canada has signed United Nations treaties that establish legal standards for this right. So more importantly, the right to adequate housing is not just limited to four walls and a roof. It's the right to live in safety, in peace, and in dignity. So the right to housing is linked to countless other human rights, such as the right to health, education, equality, employment, as well as Indigenous rights. Under international human rights laws, there are 7 elements that define adequate housing, and everyone in Canada has the fundamental right to housing that meets all of those criteria. And we can't just view it as a privilege reserved for those who can afford it, or who have good credit, or who are born in Canada, or who are able to live independently without assistance. And homelessness is an affront to that human dignity. It is a violation of the right to housing. It contravenes our right to liberty and security of the person guaranteed by that charter. And it reinforces inequalities. It perpetuates colonialism. It threatens life and health. And Canada is rightly considered a model of prosperity and respect for human rights. But for too long, we've allowed this horrific violation of human rights to continue that affect hundreds of thousands of people every year. And it's absolutely unacceptable that people are homeless in a country like Canada. And the National Housing Strategy Act enshrines the obligation to end homelessness in law. And the Act reaffirms that housing is a fundamental human right and commits the government to progressively realize the right to adequate housing. And I'm going on because very loaded question you asked, but I do want to finish by saying the National Housing Strategy Act not only recognizes the right to housing, but also creates a series of accountability tools to enforce that right, including my role as Canada's first federal housing advocate.
So you segued perfectly into my next question, was that you have been recently appointed, well, you were recently reappointed actually as Canada's first federal housing advocate. I'm going to ask if you can share a little bit about your journey to get there, and then also looking back since 2022, what stands out to you as the most significant progress or challenges in advancing that right to housing that you're speaking of?
Oh, wow. The journey to get there. That's I have an environmental science degree, and when I graduated high school, I had a choice. I could go study fine arts, maybe at Emily Carr, or I could be practical and get a science degree. So I got a science degree in environmental sciences, and I graduated during a major recession, and I read Wade Davis, which kind of blew my mind, and decided I wanted to be an ethnobotanist. So then I went back and I studied anthropology and archaeology and made a choice, and I did a master's degree in anthropology at Dalhousie University. I did my undergrad at the University of Alberta. I was really interested in people's relationships with their environment, and little did I know that a bit of my master's thesis, which is about fishing communities and the displacement of people, would actually focus quite a bit on financialization of housing and the impact that has on local communities, and on gentrification. And then I thought, I was hoping to do a PhD, and that didn't work out. There was a lot of mitigating factors that meant that I couldn't go pursue that PhD. But I ended up in Ottawa hoping to find a government job. I had a varied work experience, thinking that I'd be great for government. And again, a hiring freeze. And I became an artist and a musician by default, and eventually accidentally fell into housing. I started working for the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada, as well as the Cooperative Housing Association of Eastern Ontario, and that was kind of my in to housing. And for almost 20 years, I did the 360 on the ground. I worked front lines. I ended up being a business partner of a co-op or a nonprofit housing development organization. And so I worked as a developer. I became the executive director of a nonprofit housing corporation that had over 200 units. And then I kind of crossed the floor, and I was the executive director of a housing loss prevention organization. And there I became very, very, very active in advocacy and around housing rights and the non-market housing sector. And then this opportunity came up. There's a change in legislation around the human right to housing, and I thought, oh, this job, I really want this job. And I applied, and it took a long time. In fact, it took well over a year from the time that I applied to when I was appointed, and it's been quite the journey. So I'm not a lawyer. For me, what I bring to the job is that I can look at policy and see how it will likely not do what it's intended to do once it hits the ground. And I can, because I've been working so closely with people with lived experience and seeing how it really affects them. So that's what I kind of brought to the table, was that 360 perspective of on the ground. And meanwhile, had done a lot of things around legislation, throughout my almost 20-year journey before I came into this job. So now 2022 rolls around and I'm appointed, and it was, at first it was just, yay, they're going to appoint the advocate. And then I thought, oh my goodness, it's going to be me. And the weight of it was insane, but it's an incredible privilege as well. At the time, I had a team of 14 people. It was just an amazing, incredible team. We've suffered some massive funding cuts. We're 4 now, but we're still moving forward, full speed ahead. Very, very knowledgeable people with incredible relationships with civil society, who understand also the functionings of government and the role of the federal housing advocate, and a fantastic communications team as well. And when you start something right at the beginning, a big legislative change like enshrining the human right to housing for the first time in Canadian legislation, that means that you have to naturalize that change. So we spent a lot of time, and media was a great friend of mine. They were very kind to me, and just giving me that platform to talk about the human right to housing. And I remember reading articles of certain publications saying, well, that's not true. It can't be a right because it's not in the charter. And so there was a lot of rights for people in Canada that aren't in the charter, first of all, but it's working in an environment where there was a lot of polarization and trying not to fall into those traps of being polarized, of being weaponized, and educating the public and empowering people around the right to housing, and then also educating governments and government officials to understand what those nice words written on a piece of paper, what it means for them, and what it means, what does it look like in practice? What does it look like on the ground? And for governments to support policies and programs, adequately fund them, and have proper data collection to be able to measure the success or the failures of some of these programs. And most importantly, to see how it impacts the people that are most affected. So over the past 3.5 years, I've worked on with 4 separate housing ministers at the federal level. So that in itself is a huge challenge because it's starting all over again, and for some of them, and sometimes the staff was the same, and sometimes it's a complete change in staff. And the other challenge is that housing is very complex and it overlaps in all the jurisdictions. And so my work can't just be focused at the federal level. I needed to work at all levels of government and ensure that they're actually working together and that they have the political will to do so, and to support and fund real solutions and not just nice words, and have the bureaucracies implement these solutions. So a real challenge really is the lack of cooperation and coordination between levels of government, because of politics, because of political polarization, and I think also being territorial over their jurisdiction and over the flow of money. We got a lot of provinces saying pushing back at the federal level, saying, shut up, just give us the money and mind your own business. But then, the federal government's telling the federal government, you have to take a leadership role. And this country is vast, and that what people have access to can't be so vastly or grossly different if they're on one side or another of an invisible line, whether it's a municipal line, a provincial territorial line, or if you're Indigenous, if you're on your reserve or not. And there needs to be consistency for people, regardless of where they live. So for that, it would be really nice to have counterparts at the provincial and territorial levels, as well as the municipal level, to really help support our work as the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, our reports, our research, and to help the other levels of government understand what that means, and how to implement proper nuanced solutions that work best at the local level, because everything is nuanced and a little bit different. Like I said, the country is very vast. And another huge challenge, especially with regards to financialization, is the lobby. There are a lot of people that are groups or people that have huge bank accounts that do very well with the status quo, and they don't want change. So a lot of it has been very difficult, but there's been a lot of little wins along the way too.
You've been a leading voice on encampments, and when we think about the people who have had to choose an encampment as their place of residence, what do you think our listeners and Canadians across the board most need to understand about the realities of encampment communities?
Oh, wow. Well, I think the first thing I would say is be mad about encampments, but don't be mad at the people in encampments. It's really hard to imagine that a country as rich as ours has people living in encampments. It's hard to see the level of suffering out in the open. Doesn't mean it didn't happen behind closed doors, but it's really hard to see. And I think there's certain people would have a lot of empathy, and I've seen a lot of communities come forth and help feed people, just make sure people are okay, just check in. And then, but after a while, it gets old, and then people are just frustrated. The thing about encampments are not the solution. Encampments are a physical manifestation of exactly how broken our housing and homelessness system is in this country. And it's not just a large urban center issue. I've seen encampments in the furthest reaches of the north, in rural areas, mid-sized cities as well. And there's huge complexities at play. But I like that you use the word choose. It's not an easy choice. It's not a great choice. But when out of what people are offered, this is often the only choice or the best of terrible options that they have. That people living in encampments are so exposed, so vulnerable. They're exposed to the elements, they're exposed to vitriol and anger from the public, they're exposed to violence, they're exposed to, people who are ready to prey on them. And their safety is a huge concern of mine. But for a lot of people in encampments, that is still the safest place for them to be, because the options aren't meeting their needs. The public can easily say, oh, why don't they just go to a shelter? So there's the first issue is shelters might be full. And try to put yourself in the shoes of someone who carries all of their items of survival on their back. So are they going to carry their, dismantle their camp and put it, carry everything, because they can't leave it behind, because it'll either get stolen or destroyed by police or by someone or a group that wants to raise the encampment and make people disappear from a certain spot. So if you dismantle everything, pack everything up, carry it on your back, and then stand in line for shelter, and then be told, oh, sorry, there's no room today. Well, people aren't going to do that. It's a lot to ask of people who every minute of the day is about their simple survival, of finding a place to go to the bathroom and being able to wash their hands and not be, looked at like a cockroach or treated badly, or treated like they're going to steal things, or that they're a menace, or that they're a danger. And that, there needs to be a level of compassion. Now, the solution to encampments and homelessness is adequate housing. And that takes, unfortunately, way too much time. I think the Rapid Housing Initiative has proved that it doesn't need to take that much time. But with that is the complexity of lining up the capital funding to create these homes, and then lining up the funding for the supports. Because a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people in encampments will require supports for their home to be adequate, for their home to meet their needs. There's a lot of talk around, making sure that people have access to the medical needs that they, and their prescriptions. So needing support to get to a doctor, get diagnosed, or, for things such as head injuries or a lot of other disabilities that they might have, diabetes, things that have been aggravated just by the harshness of experiencing homelessness. And then there may or may not be mental health and addiction. But even just cooking and cleaning, if accessing food on a regular basis is because people are providing food for you, it is a total shift in having to think about going to the grocery store and preparing your own food and then cleaning up afterwards. It's Jesse Thistle, in his book, in his experience, talked about having to learn to eat with a knife and fork again, because he'd been experiencing homelessness for so long that he hadn't had to use a knife and fork. So for some people, it's learning all of these things. And for some people, it's just just affordability. They don't need all of the supports, but they need somewhere that is affordable for them. But it all starts with that home and the home that meets your needs. And a lot of the latest research has also been talking about integration, that it's not just, again, four walls and a roof, it's access to the resources that you need, but access to relationships that in encampments, some people, not all, have finally found people that don't judge them, that accept them and love them for who they are, that support them, that for some people, it's the first time they had community. And to live in a home sometimes will separate people from that community. A lot of housing doesn't allow for guests, or doesn't allow for guests to stay over because it jeopardizes the subsidy. So there's a lot of thought that needs to be put into what integration means and how to do that well. So again, very complex issues. But first and foremost, I think what works, especially around supportive housing, is that people have the same rights as everyone else, and that their human rights are also respected, and that they're given a key and they're told, this is your home and you can stay here as long as you want, so that people can finally relax and slowly get out of survival mode so that they can think about what they want for life for themselves. That is really, really important. If there continues to be a focus on going back to shelter, the reality is for a lot of places, a shelter is a place with a huge open room with mats on the floor, and how well do you sleep? Where everyone is coughing and farting or in distress or snoring, or you're worried about getting robbed. How well do you sleep? And then by 8 o'clock in the morning, everyone's fed and kicked out for the rest of the day. That's not a place that's for emergencies. That's not a place to think that will replace a home. And same thing with transitional housing. Again, it's that temporary housing is for emergencies, but that can't be where people will be able to relax and just think about what's possible for them for the rest of their lives. Another thing we know.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
I want to be sure we get some. You go ahead.
Sure. Well, I think one more thing that I'm going to say about encampments is that we know that a top-down approach doesn't work, and evictions cause so much harm to people. And I'll get into. I've got so much to say about encampments, maybe for another time.
Thank you, though. Your passion is clear, and your advocacy has shed a light on the lack of safe housing infrastructure for Métis communities in Saskatchewan and Inuit and Nunavut. How can we as a nation, all levels of government, better respond to the unique housing challenges faced by Indigenous people?
Oh, wow. Well, I launched a report on housing conditions for Inuit in Nunavut and Nunatsiavut in partnership with the Nunatsiavut, Kavamanga, and Nunavut Tumgavik in November of 23. And then I did a report on Métis housing conditions in Saskatchewan in partnership with the government of Métis Nation Saskatchewan in September of 24. So Indigenous housing, right at the beginning of my mandate, I declared it as one of my priorities because of the gross overrepresentation of Indigenous folks who are experiencing homelessness and housing precarity, regardless of where they live. And I saw that very clearly when I was working on the ground. So we know that the needs are great, and it's going to take many years to resolve. In many cases, Inuit and Métis continue to live in absolutely deplorable housing conditions, despite repeated nice words, repeated promises by multiple levels of government. They just somehow always get the door slammed in their face when it's finally their turn to get the flow of funding. We've seen some really great, budget announcements over the last few years, a lot of really great intentions, and yet somehow the money doesn't flow. And it's been a horrible slap in the face for these people. And the impact is just so absolutely terrible on these folks. But for a lot of people, it's out of sight, out of mind, right? We see a lot of homelessness, especially the more we go out west. The face of homelessness is predominantly Indigenous, but the realities and the conditions that they live in, for most people in Canada, they don't see it. What happens on reserves, or what happens in Inuit territory, or what happens in Métis territory. But it is really the result of staggering failures by multiple levels of government over many decades to actually invest in and respect Indigenous rights as well as their human rights. So we made several recommendations in the report that we did it in collaboration with the Indigenous governments. So to have a decolonized approach to the work, we were invited. First of all, you don't show up and say, "Hey, we think you're in trouble. We're gonna swoop in. I'm a white woman from Ottawa, and I'm gonna swoop in and save the day." So we were invited. So that was the first thing, and they showed us what they wanted us to see. We met the people they wanted us to meet, and we co-developed the recommendations. And for the Inuit reports, we made sure that the reports were not only available in French and English, but also in Inuktitut. Because how dare we write about people when they themselves would not be able to understand what we had written. And so the chief recommendations for all of the reports is the need for long-term sustainable funding from all levels of government to address the housing crisis for the Inuit. That Indigenous people must be able to control and manage their own housing so that it can meet the needs of their people. And this is a key solution to respond to the unique housing challenges faced by Indigenous peoples. This right to self-determination is also in line with the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous people, or what we call UNDRIP. And maybe some of you have heard about UNDRIP. But the housing crisis for Indigenous people has been going on for decades as a result of government underfunding and neglect. And we have to hold the provincial and federal governments accountable for fixing it. And we need a plan to move forward. We need a political will to move forward on the solutions that we and many others have identified. And we need long-term commitment and funding, and not just from one electoral cycle to the next. Like I said, by the time they make a funding announcement or a budget announcement, and then the money's supposed to flow, and then whoops, change in government. Sorry, that's horrible. Imagine that, living on that hope. Or how do you have hope? Or how do you have trust? So we need to see greater cooperation between governments and a stronger leadership role for the federal government. And we need all levels of government to have a role to play in addressing the housing crisis. And in both reports, the Inuit report and the Métis report, we recommended the creation of a provincial housing advocate role to hold the province or territory accountable. So the advocate is an important accountability tool. We would need someone who can hold governments to account on their housing promises and make sure that these promises are human right compliant as well, and that the money flows, and to also act as a bridge between governments and rights claimants, and who can convene discussions and advocate alongside the people who are impacted. And the provincial advocate or territorial advocate would help to ensure the government is following through on their promises and their commitments. So to be quite frank, what is at stake is an entire generation's future. So it's heavy.
Yeah, certainly. And when you're speaking of systemic issues, I know one of your key responsibilities is to spotlight these and refer them for formal review. Can you share a bit about the three major systemic housing issues that you've referred to National Housing Council and why they matter?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, review panels it is an excellent opportunity to take a closer look at a systemic issue. Review panels are led by experts from the National Housing Council and invite other experts, community members, and people with lived experience to partake in this process. And they provide an opportunity to collect and evaluate data, identify data gaps, provide policy analysis, and engage directly with people with lived experience. It's also crucial to encourage the participation of those affected by the issue in question. So it's an opportunity for people affected by the issue at hand to share their experiences and the solutions. Really, they're the ones who hold the key about the solutions that they would like to see. They are the experts. The outcome of a review panel, it's a set of evidence-based findings and recommendations which are forwarded to the federal minister responsible for housing, and these recommendations become an essential tool that the government can use to improve investments and create inclusive policies and programs. They also become an advocacy tool for civil society. And the key is that the recommendations are developed with the voices of the people with lived experience in mind, and it ensures that reforms are based in both human rights principles and practical realities. So you've mentioned that I made three referrals, a referral for three different issues for a review panel to the National Housing Council. The first one was the financialization of purpose-built rental. The second was housing for women and gender diverse people. And the most recent one is on accessible housing. And so to talk about financialization, that continues to plague us. Really, any pathway out of financialization crisis has to be grounded in human rights. That's key. And Canada's recognized that housing is a human right, and that means that everyone has a right to safe and dignified home that they can afford and that meets their needs, and where they can stay without fear of being pushed out. So, the next steps around the work of financialization, any solution to this issue needs to be grounded in human rights, period. So I've had a lot of groups kind of talk around financialization, or say, well, financialization for housing, or, but in the end, we know that financialization of housing has completely eroded or eaten up or destroyed any naturally occurring housing affordability in this country. And we can't build our way out of the crisis. And it costs a lot of money to build affordable housing or non-market housing. So in the end, it's to make the financialization of housing less attractive for investors and to have proper tenancy rights. But that sounds great, but as we know, rights written in law in a nice piece of paper doesn't guarantee its actual application of it. And so we talk about access to housing, access to justice, access to supports to be able to have the tenancy rights respected and realized. So there's a lot to it. But when we talk about financialization, and that's treating housing as an investment vehicle versus treating it like a place to live and a basic need for people, Canada has a lot of regulations that they should put in place. And first of all is transparency of ownership. One of the claims is that, financialization, especially by real estate investment trusts, it's a myth. They're the focus of a witch hunt. It's not them. But if you're looking at ownership of housing, especially purpose-built rental, it's bought, sold, and traded a lot on the local and international markets. And It's treated as a place to, like I said, prioritize making as much profit as possible for their shareholders, as opposed to, I mean, landlords and homeowners, owners is nothing new. But in the past, landlords were people who made their living at being a landlord, and their product was rental accommodation. So they focused on making a good product. And now it's about just extracting wealth, and it bolsters the GDP for Canada, as a lot of other kind of financialization, not just in purpose-built rental. But it extracts wealth, but it doesn't do anything else. It doesn't create jobs, and so it leaves people with less money to spend on other things, like education or on vacations or in other sectors of the economy. So it really is absolutely detrimental in its, if we look at it purely from an economic perspective. But from a human rights perspective, the impact of financialization is driving people out of their home, because the purpose of a financialized housing unit or housing, let's just say a building, is to extract as much possible wealth from that. And it's no longer about creating a good home for people or good service for people. And so all the cuts are made. There might be some upgrades that are done, usually as an excuse to get rid of the people who live there and who are maybe protected by rent control. And a lot of the time, not all, but a lot of the time, any kind of retrofits or upgrades are cosmetic. And it's a way to get different tenants that can pay more. But what happens to the tenants that can't pay more than what they were paying there? First of all, the affordability of those units is lost forever. It will never go back. And we have a huge shortage of housing that's available for people at a very low rate. A lot of people have also argued that financialization, it's not a lot. It's a very small percentage of the housing that's owned in Canada by real estate investment trusts or financial firms. But what the target has been very local. I would say Little Jamaica in Toronto is a big example, where it has targeted certain communities, and the impact of these communities has been just horrible, because not only are people losing their homes, a lot of these communities were built around small businesses, and the small businesses needed the local community in order to keep them alive, or even the informal relationships people had, or with an informal economy that went with it, like shared caregiving or shared babysitting. And when people are displaced, then they lose that. And that too is really important to their survival and their sense of self. So a lot of communities that have been targeted for financialization, not surprisingly, have been racialized, or are racialized communities. And so again, the impact has been very, very deep for those that have experienced that. The other solution has been that Canada needs to invest in on-market housing. This is the map out of the crisis. I want to talk more about financialization, but I should also spend time on the other issues. The National Housing Council announced the launch of a review panel on the right to housing for women and gender diverse people called NEHA. They've announced it in November of 24, so this is still ongoing. For that review panel, I proposed both written and oral recommendations before the panel to convey what I've heard from women, two-spirit, trans, non-binary, and gender diverse people about their experiences with homelessness and inadequate housing. And these rights holders, oh wow, they've so courageously spoken out about the devastating impact of homelessness on their dignity, on their well-being and on their human rights, including grave and lasting harms to their physical and mental health that were, heightened exposure to violence and sexual exploitation, separation from their children, and the discriminatory treatment by landlords or law enforcement, service providers, and the general public. And these impacts are most acute for Indigenous women or two-spirit, trans, non-binary, and gender diverse people, but sometimes, even with fatal consequences. So housing insecurity and homelessness are among the most important drivers of the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And what we've heard is urgent. Across the country, women and gender diverse people are being denied safe, affordable homes, and they're forced into unsafe shelters, dangerous housing, or situations of hidden homelessness, which is couch surfing or overcrowded homes or temporary arrangements that don't even get counted in the official data with the PIT counts. And, often poverty or low wages, discrimination, and violence really trap people in unsafe situations. And the system wasn't designed to reflect women's realities or the diversity of gender experiences. So people face stigma, they face criminalization, family separation, and life-threatening risks. So this is not just a housing issue, it is also a human rights violation. And when we're talking about homelessness among women, two-spirit, trans, and gender diverse people, it's a violation of human rights and Indigenous rights. So central to my recommendations is to the review panel is to urgently adopt a human rights-based plan to eliminate homelessness among women and gender diverse people. And that plan has to be set out in a specific time frame to be able to reach this goal, and it must be adequately resourced. So the review panel has wrapped up its hearings and is now going to be developing its findings and recommendations in a report to the minister responsible for housing. And finally, the third issue that I've referred is about the serious shortage of accessible and adaptable housing in Canada. This includes housing for people with disabilities, seniors, and other groups seeking equity. And currently, if we're going to talk stats, 1 in 4 Canadians over the age of 15 identifies as having a disability. So this lack of accessible housing has serious consequences, and it continues to negatively affect people's quality of life. People have told us that the inaccessibility of their housing is detrimental to their physical and mental health. And we need to be clear here that we're not just talking about wheelchair accessible. And we're not just talking about physical disability, but we've all heard that the impact of not being able to access housing that meets their needs based on their disability has led to some people with disabilities to resort to medical assistance and dying. And I think that says it all. And it's absolutely not acceptable. So the demand for accessible housing is growing in Canada, and we have, our life expectancy in this country is increasing, which is great. It also means our elderly population grows rapidly. And I was reminded by someone who sat on the council that we're all temporarily able-bodied. And the reality is our older population will experience disabilities of different kinds, not just physical disabilities, but around their vision, around their hearing, around their mental health, around their ability to live independently, safely in their homes. So, a lot of us will need more home accessibility measures at some point in our lives. And yet we all need homes and not institutions. So we hear about the urgent need for accessible housing, both from the data we have and from the consultations that I've participated in. And my office has collaborated with the Canadian Human Rights Commission to collect data on the right to housing for persons with disabilities. And this data is essential to help us understand the reality of people experiencing housing precarity with disabilities. And I can tell you that some of the findings, they are shocking. For example, persons with disabilities are overrepresented in all aspects of inadequate housing and homelessness. And furthermore, during my visits to communities across Canada, the need for accessible housing was evident absolutely everywhere. But it's particularly acute in rural, remote, and northern communities. So this is a human rights issue, and having accessible housing is crucial for people to live in dignity without discrimination, independently and within their communities. And the lack of accessible housing puts a strain on our health and social services, and it limits labor market participation and has an economic repercussions, including everyone in the end. If we can include everyone, it will make our country stronger. Again, so much I want to say about this, but I also see that I don't want to lose anyone right away.
Yeah, you have shared so much with us, and I know there's a lot more to share. So we'll have to have you back on the way home at some point. And we only have a few minutes to wrap up the show. And so I just want to thank you so much, because clearly you've touched on so many of the issues we wanted to talk about: financialization, also solutions, how we can head in the right direction. We need a sharp pivot to address this crisis. And clearly you have really done the hard work of getting out there and speaking to the people that are experiencing this, and informing solutions and plans with human-centered design at your core, I can tell. And so I just want to say thank you for your leadership as federal housing advocate, and your commitment to amplifying the voices of those most impacted by the housing crisis. Continues to be a challenge. You continue to challenge, though, and inspire change across the country. And we're so grateful for your time and the important work that you do. We'll be sure to have you back. So thank you so much for joining us on the way home.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
So that's it for today's episode of On the Way Home. Marie-Josée, thank you for your leadership, your courage, and your relentless focus and knowledge on amplifying the voices of those who too often go unheard. Marie's work as federal housing advocate reminds us that housing is not just about bricks and mortar, it's about dignity, safety, and justice. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you found today's conversation meaningful, please subscribe, share this episode, and join us again as we continue to highlight the people and ideas shaping the future of housing in Canada and beyond. On the Way Home is brought to you by Blue Door, because everyone deserves a place to call home, and until every door opens, we will keep pushing forward.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.